All right, just as a reminder, please use the chat function to submit your questions, and at the end of each talk, depending on how much time is left, we'll go through your questions and ask some of them from the speakers. Our first speaker is Jan. He is the design chapter lead in WBAA, but he does so much more than that, and you learn it within the first few minutes of talking to him. He is always working on cool or bizarre side projects with a positive impact, and from experience, I can say that no conversation is dull when once you involve Jan. So you can always rely on him to push back on ideas that are not well-founded in evidence or not tested thoroughly. And today he is going to talk to us about dashboards, something designers get asked to create quite often, especially in data-driven teams or corporates. And we are going to learn when they work or don't work and how to push back. So without further ado, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Parisa. Really looking forward to this, and thanks for the great introduction. Looking at the schedule, I think I've just won 10 minutes extra. So I think that's really good, because I really had to cramp in all the things I put down in paper into 30 minutes. So let's see how far we can get. So today I'd like to talk about dashboards. And for me, dashboards are these crazy things you see in a lot of products. So it's basically a thing that more or less just happens when people start building so-called solutions. So the thing about dashboards is that people always ask for them. Dashboards are being brought as a solution by the business, as the end goal, the flag in the ground that shows them cool stuff, crazy moving parts with all kinds of numbers and statuses. But this is basically asking users what they want, where we instead, especially as researchers, also as designers, we should be finding ourselves in the place we are in the best, in the place we need to also be in, and that's the place of starting to understand the problem. So we tend to resort to a dashboard as a response to not really understanding the full scale of a problem space. So here's the short story to my story when you need dashboards. So the answer is it's hardly ever. So today I would like to tell you why it is that dashboards are almost never a thing users need, and how to better address the problem and how to validate if the proposed solution still needs a dashboard. But in order to understand where we are today, we always have to look where we're coming from. So how did those dashboards end up in our lives, and why do we still see them that often? And to get there, I will start with enriching all of your lives with my amazing drawing skills. So here we go. Oh, here we go. So back in the days, a few centuries ago, when there was no COVID-19, we discovered that wooden wheels offered us more comfort in letting us be transported by a horse. As you can all see, this is clearly a horse. It even has a really nice tail. So we discovered that it offered us more comfort in letting us be transported by a horse and by a carriage. I'll just make sure to make the difference between the horse and the carriage, horse and carriage. But the problem with this setup currently is that the horse could be spirited and really active. And another word of a spirited horse is a dashing horse. So you might already find out where this will end. So this behavior could cause the horse to kick up mud. You can clearly see I will make some mud and rocks towards the driver of the carriage. So here was somewhere over here, there was a driver, and this person, was clearly not happy. As you can see, not happy. So what they did, they created a wooden plank to prevent the mud and the rocks from hitting the driver. And as you can imagine, this would make the driver way more happy. And at the end of the 18th century, and also the beginning of the 19th century, we turned those horsepowers into things we now know as cars. But the problem of the first problem with the dashing horse, where it would kick up mud, so I'll just make it visible again, still wasn't gone. So what they would do is take the dashboard and put it inside the car, over here. And at some point, we were able to show some of the statuses coming out of this system to the driver. So the most convenient place to put those indicators was going to be in the dashboard. And as you all know, a dashboard is not a standalone thing. And for UX, context is an incredibly important factor to take into account. So most of the time, the dashboard was part of a cockpit. And since we're already started embarking this story in the world of etymology, I will also have to explain where this word comes from. So please bear with me. The first explanation is easy to follow. So put a set of angry roosters or cocks in a pit. So a pit is actually just a dent in the ground, and you would have yourself a cockpit. But quite early in the 1700s, soldiers start using this cockpit as a metaphor for the site of grisly combat, especially when the fighting was in an enclosed area. So a dent in the ground, a pit. This then was adopted by pilots in World War I, who applied it to the cramped operating quarters of their fighter planes, their war machines. Because this thing is, after all, still a small pit where plenty of fighting took place. So there you go, there it is. This was part one of the history of the dashboard in a cockpit. And not to forget those amazing historical drawings. I now want to skip ahead of the beginning of the 19th century and want to talk about what happened there, how fear created a deep-rooted connection to a dashboard, and how these things had a big impact on the user experience today. So as you can imagine, or I think we can hardly imagine, these were tough times, World War I, World War II. There was even this German saying where they said, when they had this talk about pilots, where they said, sterben war ihr tägliches Brot. Saying, well, if you would be a pilot, then you would probably end up in a coffin, if you were to be a pilot. So the next little story I want to talk about is about this war machine. It's a famous but also an infamous war machine, and that will tell us how fear was an integral part of Cockpit, but also how these planes influenced the machine. The same machine you're currently using, or most of you are currently using, whilst listening to me. So this was the B-17 bomber, also known as the Flying Fortress, a menace in the sky and the pride of the US Army Air Corps in World War II. So pilot would navigate the skies, weaving through and tearing down Japanese and German forces, surviving shrapnel and bullets before making it back as, how they would call it, a series of holes held together by wrecked metal. But there was only one problem with this B-17 Flying Fortress. They just could not seem to stick the landing. So the plane could hold up a crew of 10, pilot, co-pilot, bomber, navigator, flight engineers, and 5 gunners, and could take down the enemy in a rock-flying fortress, but was unable to land. On coming into land, the wing flaps, these things over there, would slow the plane down, and it would then hit the runway, skid, and keel over, turn over on the runway, leaving carnage in its path. The landing gear wouldn't descend. This went on for a while, and the incidents piled pilots misreading dials, pilots falling out of the sky because they could not tell which side was up when flying, pilots unable to read instruments clearly, and even an instance of a pilot running a plane up and down the runway during an attack because the cockpit instrument had been rearranged in what was a new model and he just couldn't figure out how to fly. So whether this was stress or trauma, incompetence or freak accidents, pilots were taking the blame for the accidents that were causing damage to machinery worth thousands of dollars, and of course, more importantly, the death of all its crew members. Data showed that during one 22-month period of the war, the Air Force reported an astounding 475 crashes, just like the one in which our imaginary pilot hit the runway thinking everything was fine. But the culprit was maddeningly obvious for anyone with patience to look. When they started investigating the airplanes themselves, so talking about qualitative foundational research, talking to people about them, sitting in the cockpits, they also didn't see the evidence of poor training. Instead, they saw the impossibility of flying these planes at all. Instead of pilot error, this was the first time people introduced the term design error. So back in those days, with this research, a new paradigm was born. And this paradigm was really important, but I will just come back to that in a minute. Just for the reason why there were so many accidents happening with this flying fortress, the problem was that the pilots were crashing when they were easing into landing because the flaps and the landing gear controls, as you can hardly see on the left, looked exactly the same. So the pilots were simply reaching for the landing gear, thinking they were ready to land, but instead they were pulling the wing flaps, making the machine or the plane go down even faster, and slowing their descent and driving their planes into the ground, and also with the landing gear still tucked in. So coming back to this paradigm, this shift of thinking, looking at design errors, this had an impact or a start in our expertise of today. So this new paradigm of design error took root slowly at first, but in 1984, by the way, a really good year, 4 decades after these studies, Apple created a computer for the rest of us and said, since computers are so smart, wouldn't it make sense to teach computers about people instead of teaching people about computers? So, talking about a world of fear in the 19th century, and I don't want to elaborate too much around history, but we've seen other examples where technology, cockpits, and dashboard played an important part. So nuclear disasters in the Ukraine, the US, and Japan showed us the strong correlation between a dashboard and fear. A deep-rooted correlation for us trying to be in control as much as possible to avoid fear and danger by using dashboards. The 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania was actually mostly because of a human error problem, or a design problem. After the accident, there was this guy who investigated the scene to find what caused this error. You might know the guy. His name is Don Norman, the same person that coined the term human-centered design, and also the same person who started a company where probably a larger part of you did the training. Norman said, the control room and computer interfaces at 3 Mile Island could not have been more confusing if they had tried. He explained how the linear array of buttons, switches, and indicators arranged in equally spaced straight lines may have had made sense on paper to engineers, but were not intuitive to plant operators at all. So this was the last part of the history lesson, the history of the dashboard and the cockpit, where people acted as the central processing unit in this world of fear. So let us now go back to today and see what changed in terms of technology, but how behavior is still quite the same. So we used to have dashboards positioned like this. So we had some machines with their statuses. There were some mechanical gauges, and that were directly linked to a dashboard, making the user processing all the signals, trying to be in control and trying to control their fears. But yeah, this changed, luckily, because we're now living in a more modern world. So we still have machines somewhere in the end of our spectrum. Beginning of 19th century, we discovered the electrons, and therefore we developed electronics. And you can tie these electronics to a central processing unit that's then now being connected to a dashboard. But the thing is, somehow the user still wants to be in control, and most of the time, especially in terms of a dashboard, the user is still being acted as a processing unit. And here's the key thing. Dashboards themselves are completely passive. They're not a job to be done. They're never part of a really delightful journey or a really efficient task. And since they are passive, the user has to find, process, study them, and has to figure out if there's something she or he has to pay attention to. So in the end, still the user has to do all the work. So the user has to process the signals, although we know we have solutions in place, like this little blue box, who can do that for us. And the odds of the user making a mistake by either not paying attention to the dashboard, or not knowing when the number is trying to tell them something, or not being able to know what to do about it, those are basically mistakes waiting to be happen. So dashboards are problematic. They are designed elements that are partially implemented and not done. So I like to take this apart and see how we can prevent this, or as Parisa said, how we can push this back a little bit better. And I like to show you how to approach this thing, by using a model from Jared Spool. So we can think of a dashboard as a solution, as a type of solution, as a proposed solution. But as a designer, and that's the important part here, you always have to think at the UX outcome. So this is the UX outcome. And the UX outcome basically answers the question, and I will just type it out here. If we do a good job, if we do a good job, how will it, sorry, I have a pen in my hand, improve someone's life? Okay. So this is what the UX outcome tells us. So this is UX. I think UX and a journey, it's always about an improvement in someone's life. And what we want to talk about is what is the improvement that we want to deliver to our user. So a dashboard gives transparency into a system, but does that contribute to the actual improvement? And that's the question we need to answer. Does that give user improvement? So this, like a lot of other things, starts with understanding. And of course, we only gain understanding through research. So what we really need to understand is the problem we're trying to solve. Problem to solve. And one way of framing the problem is that we look at what the current user experience is. Current. I will just abbreviate this because I think most of you will know the abbreviation. Current user experience. So let's take a look at this little example from Tesla. I'll just zoom in a bit. So this is another dashboard visibility into a system. So it shows the energy spent in the past 5 miles, and it should encourage the driver to be more energy aware and drive more economically. The thing is, nobody uses this because the user problem to solve is not clear. What probably a better solution would be to let the computer do all this processing and benchmarking and just adjust acceleration accordingly. So in the end, we can just hand over the solution to the computer, let somebody else do the processing. So we can get rid of the dashboard solution, and suddenly we have a different solution to our problem. Let me just zoom out a little bit more. And as you all know, great designers don't fall in love with the solution. Great designers fall in love with the problem. So the more we know about our problem, the better we do our research, the more we're going to understand it, the better we will come up with a solution, which is hardly ever a dashboard. So there's also a follow-up approach to this, and it's really simple. So what if we still feel the solution is a reflection of signals that needs to be processed? Doesn't that just sound like a dashboard? In that case, the next thing that you want to ask yourself is, can a machine do it? And in order to test that assumption, I always apply a rule of thumb from Andrew Ng. He's kind of the godfather of machine learning and AI. This rule always helps me define if we really should show something to the user or stick to the known sayings like "don't make me think," focuses. So these rules always help me define if I should really build something and I should really bother the user with the solution. And it's basically saying, can we, what the user could do within a second, is it something we can learn a computer to do? And if we can, then we let the computer learn it, and we don't bother the user by doing it. So I will just read it out. Anything a typical human can do within 1 second of thought, we can probably now or soon automate with AI. And I've never seen this rule of thumb broken in the products and projects we're working on. So I really find this a useful rule of thumb coming from the godfather of machine learning. So let's take these models to the test. And then I'm finishing off. Case 1. This is a dashboard, and excuse my Dutch, but this is the latest dashboard I came across because I got the assignment for people to help me out redesigning this dashboard, and it basically just ended up with not having a dashboard because it was not clear at all which problems we're going to solve with this dashboard. So this is a dashboard for fleet managers. So this is a role within the company that take care of all the lease cars. And it's just showing a lot of information, but it's not solving any problem that the fleet manager would have. So in the end, the fleet manager, the challenge is, or their goal is to make sure everybody's happy by using their car, everyone is safe, and not too much money is being spent purposely. So the outcome of this exercise would just be we can let the computer create a benchmark and see if some people are really outliers in that sense that they maybe use their travel card or the card they can actually fuel up with used for other cars than their lease car. So this is just a really easy signal you can create by a computer. And the rest of those widgets, like how many people use or do fuel up their cars on a highway, and what are the costs of the total fleet management. These are just for the tasks that the fleet manager has, are totally not applicable. So this was an easy one, but I do want to point out I still see a lot of these things, and once you start asking basic questions, it just it just doesn't hold up to really create these kind of dashboards. Then we have the speedometer, and in the end, the speedometer is only required for one reason: to help you comply with the law. So if you're driving in an environment with no speed limits, such like an off-road or a racetrack, you don't need a speedometer. And indeed, many race cars don't have one. And a competent driver, so being more aware of the possibilities of the user itself, should be able to assess the safe speed without reference to their speedo based on the current weather conditions, topography of the road, and quality of the road surface, presence of other road users and nearby pedestrians or animals, etc. So knowing your speed doesn't help you to do this. In some cases, can even become a distraction. So the problem to solve here is that we want people to comply with the law. And we can ask ourselves, since we have the information, since we know what the speed limits are on our roads and are on the ways, then probably a computer can learn this or can do this within a second. It's just a correlation of real basic data. And we don't have to pay attention to any of these numbers in our dashboards. So we can get rid of the speedometer. And then I'm even not talking about autonomous driving yet. Then the last case, I had the privilege to work on this cockpit. So this is an air traffic control cockpit over at Amsterdam. It's actually not in Schiphol itself. It's actually in Hoofddorp, so nearby Schiphol, because there are a lot more air traffic controllers than just in the tower of Schiphol. But those people have one of the world's most stressful jobs. So in this cockpit, there's a life and death element, and plus the need for like razor sharp reactions on everything, like a terrorist attack or extreme weather, things coming through other channels. And despite the apparent complexity of the task and the high-tech appearance, it's still a job that relies completely on the ability and the skill of the user. So these are just a lot of signals that the user has to process and has to be really sharp and really heavily trained in order to make the right decisions. This is something that currently we cannot let the machine learn this. So this still needs capabilities of the user itself. This still needs processing of our user. So yeah, here you have it. So I hope next time, if you're being dragged into a dashboard, please remind my key takeaways. First of all, focus on the desired UX outcome. And then second, ask yourself if a machine can do it. And remember, you hardly ever need a dashboard. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Harmjan, for that presentation. Very interesting history and very practical tips. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat and I'll ask them from Harmjan. But I have a question myself. So if you already have been working on a dashboard for a product that you're working on, how would you transition to something better?
Yeah, I think that's actually the experience I had working on this latest, here's a dashboard, please fix some problems. And I think the shortest way is getting at it from a business perspective. So if you're really starting to talk about, okay, how will this also improve somebody's life and how can we make this measurable? So from all of the things we put into the dashboard, the effort we put in of making this work to the user, what does it actually bring us? How will this improve business? And I think you can do a way better job by focusing on the UX outcome than just having a conversation with those business people about what the dashboard itself actually brings.
Yeah. Thanks. Good question. Good answer. Sorry. Another question that I have myself: how much do you think fear still has a deep connection with the dashboard?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. First of all, I wouldn't know exactly, but I really do believe that some things, some systems that have been there for ages and in earlier generations still have a big impact on us. And sometimes I compare dashboards to marriages, and I can imagine not a lot of people aligning with me on this. But back in the days, marriage was also just invented to gain extra land and to gain extra troops to fight your land. And at some point, a priest made it more, a priest had to be involved in order to make marriage less sinful or make your life less sinful. And nowadays, we still expect that a relation or a marriage is successful when in the end of the relation, we take each other to our graves. And I think this is also a really old way of thinking that's really deep-rooted and engraved from our history. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from the chat. Hanneke is asking, what is your experience when you propose to let go of the dashboard? I would think people like to feel as if they are in control and would be hesitant or scared to let go of a dashboard.
Yeah, so I do think that's indeed a big challenge, and there needs to be transition. You really need to bridge that gap. It's not that you can just take the thing away. That they always had the idea that there was something that really helped them out. So it's probably going to be painful, but it's better to process the pain if just bit by bit. So just having like deeper conversation on what you're actually trying to reach, I think then you can really improve the conversation itself and also get them along in not using a dashboard anymore, or really helping them out and gaining proof for that or evidence.
And Nagin is asking, do you recommend that in order to build a dashboard, in addition to the user, we also make a persona for the machine, like Robona for robots, for example?
Yeah, well, I think, that's an interesting thought. I think in the end, what we're also trying to do when we're building more specialized model or algorithm, we somehow try to put that in a flow or in a model to explain to the user what's actually happening. And if you make those things, if you make especially systems more clear, and if you also want to reduce fear, also by being more transparent and just show what's actually happening, I think that would really help by making the entire story a way better. And if the machine has a larger part in that in your story, then it really sounds like a persona. That's something I will keep in mind. It's interesting.
Yeah, indeed. So I think that's the questions for now. Thank you again, Harmjan. It was very insightful.